rights.
I think if we can have our speakers just come to the stage while I read out.
While we wait for our speakers, I would like to remind everyone how we're taking Q&As. So at the opening slide, there was a line of instructions regarding how we're taking Q&As for each session. The thing is, we received more than 1,000 subscribers to attend online, who we are hoping to be able to connect around the world and watch the live stream. So to be able to include them, we are taking all questions online. The easiest thing is for you to please go to IHRB's LinkedIn profile, and then you can drop your question on the chat. Just as a slight reminder, I mean, not reminder, but what we have just experienced in the first session were a bit of technical problems, the way we're used to with the hybrid events. Our team is working right now on correcting them. So please, for this session, drop your questions on IHRB's LinkedIn live stream. We'll be collecting them and presenting them at the end of the panel. Thank you.
So I think while we're waiting for Melissa, we have two Melissas with us today. Let me just, welcome our speakers and maybe just go through your bios for a couple of minutes. So we have with us, maybe I'll start with Akash. Akash is a human rights practitioner and policy leader with nearly 2 decades of experience spanning grassroots engagement, international organizations, and corporate human rights strategy. He is currently the principal EMEA policy lead for Amazon's Human Rights and Social Impact team, where he leads efforts to translate human rights policies into practice across high-risk sectors and complex labor environments. He brings deep expertise in forced labor, ethical recruitment, and migrant worker protection with experience across migration corridors connecting the Middle East, Asia, Africa, and Europe. We also have with us Melissa Chin, who has close to 20 years of experience working on issues related to natural resource management, climate change, and business and human rights. She currently leads the Responsible Sourcing Unit for Proforest Southeast Asia and supports multinational companies in the development and implementation of responsible production and sourcing strategies, including human rights and environmental due diligence. And finally, we also have Melissa Akhir, who is currently Commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia and has 19 years of experience in access to justice and human rights. I think while a lot of Melissa's work is grounded in evidence-based advocacy, focusing on intersections between gender and children's rights, Melissa collaborates with public interest lawyers, human rights institutions, and youth leaders to strengthen protection and accountability for children, but also for vulnerable groups. Welcome to all speakers. So I'll just quickly start with a session description, but I don't want to spend too much time and leave a lot more time for all of you to speak. But Malaysia's National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights for the next 5 years has created an important entry point for moving responsible recruitment from principle to implementation. So the inclusion of the employer's pays principle signals a clear policy commitment to address some of these really stubborn issues related to recruitment and sort of systemic exploitation, while also strengthening labor migration governance as a whole. So the key question now is really what comes next. And so with me, we'll sort of get speakers here to navigate some of these questions for us. So let me start with Melissa on the other end. So migrant workers in Malaysia continue to experience severe burdens related to recruitment fees. So for example, we all have heard this very familiar story of Bangladeshi workers in Malaysia paying an estimated 20,000 ringgit, which is about $5,000 in fees. Could you start us off by sharing how workers end up paying these astronomical fees to get a job here in Malaysia?
Thank you. Okay. Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and the organizers for having SUHAKAM, which is the National Human Rights Commission, as mentioned. If I can quickly introduce, our work within the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights is we are in the working group, but there's 2 layers for the monitoring of human rights. So I lead on gender as well as business and human rights, but we look at the first layer would be all the laws and agencies that apply in Malaysia, the courts and all of the legal systems or informal systems. And SUHAKAM monitors this in terms of human rights principles. So coming to your question, for our role as a statutory body reporting to Parliament on business and human rights, we conduct consultations. And consultations, we're trying to move away from just looking at as vulnerable groups. Instead, we're looking at workers as rights holders with full rights and are supposed to access justice and remedies. So for the consultations that we have and the amount that was said, we consulted with a few sectors before, plantations, manufacturing sector, construction sector, and medical supply sectors. We also had a zonal approach. So if you can imagine, I don't have the infographics now, imagine an infographic of the map of Malaysia. We did zonal approaches in Penang, which is up north of the peninsula, in Johor, which is the south, and also East Malaysia in both Borneo State, Sabah and Sarawak. And within there, we heard about a complex chain of actors. It's not just one person or party, but starting from, let's say, sourcing from their village levels or intermediaries, documentation, etc. And when we ask, most workers do not even know what they are paying for. And the answers are mixed. There's a lot of mention of legislative administrative costs or intermediaries, but a lot of rights holders and workers are reluctant actually to disclose to us the amount. However, the ones that do, especially from Nepal and Bangladesh, informed us confidentially, they were very scared of the repercussions. Starting from 18,000, you mentioned 20,000, they were 22,000 ringgit. The most that we have heard even exceeded 50,000 ringgit. So for all of these, the workers had to take out a lot of debt bondage, loans, sell their family assets, mortgage their property, and borrow from really dangerous informal lenders. So this is the struggle where Malaysia and SUHAKAM are trying to work with other countries, especially in Southeast Asia. So this year, SUHAKAM or Malaysia is hosting other national human rights commissions in Southeast Asia. We're in this federation together called CNF. So within this hosting and this July, we are going to ask all the Southeast Asian countries, can we find out from the start of the recruitment process to the arrival country of where the work process is? And within the complaints that we receive, it's always mixed with other issues. Working hours, conditions during work, passport retention, especially for domestic workers, for which SUHAKAM have consulted. There's many of you in here, and we would like to continue within the range of work, including looking at CEDAW and CEDAW principles and elements regarding exploitative situations faced by women workers. So for all of this, do you want to hear about some numbers that SUHAKAM has? We gave you some on the amount of bondage, right, just now. But from 2020 to 2026, there's 79 cases that are completed, meaning they had to navigate all of the processes, which is tedious and lengthy, but 79 cases of rights holders are completed, but 29 are still in investigation. However, we see overall that this is responsible recruitment is not just a technical issue, it's a human rights issue, because everywhere we see exploitative cases involving their dignity, their freedom of movement, their access to justice especially. I'll go more into that with CEDAW, if that answers the question first.
Thanks, Mel. I think having that statistic is really useful. So you mentioned 79 cases have been completed. What portion of that includes sort of issues related to recruitment fees? I know you've mentioned that they're sort of lumped together as sort of multiple intersecting reasons. But if you have a number for the portion, that would be great. But also, how has SUHAKAM addressed some of these complaints?
That's a bit more of a nuance and layered because within our questioning in a rights holder sensitized manner, they don't see the issues in isolation. They see it together. So it's harder to have a hard number, but sometimes they don't even identify it as irresponsible recruitment, that it wasn't, there was zero fees on them and then paid for by the employer. That didn't happen for them, things like that. That wasn't processed. So within the range of work for SUHAKAM as a Human Rights Commission, we would like to work more closely with workers and with unions to have this capacity to have a checklist that they know that this is happening, and therefore we can tackle the issue in a more focused manner. So I'm unable to give you the direct percentage because, to be fair, within SUHAKAM, our human rights education with workers have to move more before we can have these numbers. Whether that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Melissa. So maybe over to you, Akash. We argue that these deficits in the recruitment system, particularly in Malaysia and maybe in other countries, sort of makes this a governance issue. What are the main challenges brands and suppliers face in applying the employer pays principle across complex supply chains? But also, what role does meaningful regulation play, especially in the context of workers' countries of origin?
Great. Thanks very much, Jehan, and thanks for having me. And great to see lots of familiar faces around here. I think it's an important question, right? Like, I think if in the beginning, in the opening plenary, it was talked about how you had the concept of employer pays, which was not really accepted over 10 years, but now a lot of brands are talking about it, which is great. But over those 10 years, like, what has substantially changed, right? Like, there are lots of intrinsic challenges in making those policy principles a reality for workers that need it the most. So what are some of those challenges and how can we navigate that? So for instance, and most folks in the room are aware of this, there is a lot of convincing that needs to happen across the supplier base. The various tiers within the contracting chain are used to their overseas agencies. They've worked with them for decades. Sometimes these are relationships they've had father to son or mother to daughter who've been having and owning those businesses, right? And now you're stepping in and telling them, do not use them, use this new agency who are ethical and do not charge workers any fees. So changing those mindsets, shifting relationships that they may have had for years is a substantial move that we're asking across the supply chain to happen. So, and that's takes a significant amount of time and investment, and it's not just about we will have a goal by end of X year to hire workers without paying any fees. It practically does not work that way. If you also look at, I think there's a recent IOM report that talks about the whole decade of how responsible recruitment has actually worked or where it has faltered. I think one of the big lessons that we can all pay closer attention to is how points in time engagement do not work. Sure, you can have a training, you can bring folks together once or twice, but how does that really lead to long-term, substantive, transformative change for vulnerable workers who need that the most? And that's not just about we want to engage at this point in time, but how do you build a 5 or a 10-year-long vision, and what are the steps that you take today that help us get there at that point in time? Secondly, I think the point on direct versus subcontracting workers within your supply chain is very important to pay close attention to. I think traditionally brands tend to engage with their direct employees, which is understandable, but that's also not where the bulk of your human rights risk are. It's within the less visible subcontracting tier 1, tier 2, and further down that we need to pay more attention to. It becomes even more complex when there's so much fragmentation in the accountability and responsibility of making this happen. It's not just brands, it's not just employers or suppliers, it's recruitment agents, it's governments of countries of origin and destination, it's various audit firms that may be involved, it's the human rights groups, it may be the embassies that may have to step in from time to time. it's a lot of fragmentation in accountability at depending on what point of the migration journey that worker is on. So how do you bring all of this together is also a challenge, right? I think on your question on the regulation, right? I think it's important. It's there are lots of regulatory requirements in key countries of origin that mandate that workers do not pay any fees, or if they do, some countries have capped what those amounts are, and then it becomes a challenge where in the destination countries or for brands, it's very clear workers do not pay. But then different governments may have different requirements, and that becomes in itself a substantive challenge to navigate. If you take a step back, right, I think there is also a race to the bottom if you look at this macroeconomically, geopolitically between countries of origin, where if you have a country in Asia that may have more regulations step in, rightfully to protect their citizens, you may have another country take its place, right? And then it's this conveyor belt of regulations that come in. And when you have a lot of regulation, it doesn't necessarily solve the problem because workers will still want economic stability and be able to make their own choices. It rather pushes these issues irregular, underground, becomes undocumented, becomes a lot harder to understand and pay attention to. So regulation is important, but how you do that smartly in a balanced way where you can protect your citizens, but also guard against making this undocumented or pushing it underground is important as well.
Thanks so much, Akash. I think you mentioned the race to the bottom, and that really sort of defines almost how labor migration works in Asia, particularly in ASEAN and beyond. I'm wondering, what are the role of MOUs, for example, right? These in itself can be, in the process of MOUs can be disruptive. So one year you have or will allow X amount of workers to come in, capped at, a few thousand, and then by next year we're not allowing anyone to come in anymore. Obviously that has such a big impact on supply chains. Do you have any thoughts on MOUs?
I mean, ultimately, like it's governments that can only governments are able to implement public policy initiatives, legislate laws, requirements, and make sure that those are implemented, right? So I think MOUs, BLAs, bilateral agreements, whatever the appropriate term is, are a critical governance document that helps regularize and stabilize how responsible recruitment can look between countries of origin and destination. But we also need to make sure that businesses and private sectors and other partners play their role in making that happen. To my earlier point, the fragmented accountability. How do the various partners step in at the appropriate point and are able to help partner with the responsible recruitment platforms that governments are trying to abide by? So businesses and the private sector have a critical role to play there in making that happen.
Thank you so much. I think it really talks to how there should be more collaborative efforts rather than just having sort of consultations, maybe. Let's move on to Melissa Chin. So the NAP B+HR, which was launched last year, makes a specific reference to the employer pays principle and the need to identify the gaps in sort of implementing a zero-cost policy for Malaysia. And this complements, a lot of the work that's been done under the National Action Plan on Forced Labour as well. What are the main implementation gaps that you still see between a company's commitment to responsible recruitment and what actually happens at the supplier and recruitment agency level?
I think with what some of the speakers have already alluded to, I mean, there's a lot of challenges, especially when you think about how you're going to cascade these requirements past your T1s, closer to the upstream, where, a lot of this risk lies. And over the years also, we have seen that, companies have, first, it all started with awareness raising. There's a lot of capacity building workshops with suppliers, etc. But, you have to move beyond the training. After you have done the training, so what? What is the action on the ground? What is the actual kind of like impacts on the ground? So I think now the difficulty really is how then, would buyers then kind of cascade down these due diligence requirements, which, they are feeling the heat from, from the countries that they operate, where there are now legislations for mandatory human rights due diligence. How are they going to cascade it down to their suppliers, and also, ensuring that, they are being implemented, and, the risk is adequately kind of like taken care of. So I think now also the issue is about creating meaningful partnerships with your suppliers. How do you bring your suppliers alongside that journey, right? Because you don't want it to create like, oh, this is a requirement, I have to comply, that's separate from, the business. But really, in terms of integration and then building the business case for your suppliers, hey, if you do this, this is good for your business, and this is how you can benefit from it. And it's not just because, you're sending your products to one buyer, but then also because it is going to be a norm, and then this also kind of benefits how you're going to market yourself to other markets as well. And I guess also, is thinking about leverage and creating a carrot and stick approach. So not just saying to, the suppliers, this is what you have to do, but then also think about, the kind of technical and financial assistance that you can give. Because responsible recruitment, as has been highlighted in the earlier session as well, is expensive, it's an investment, increases the cost. And then, how can you look at, kind of like sharing, create some sort of shared responsibility over that cost? What kind of assistance as a buyer or even other stakeholders in the value chain? How then can you support this with your suppliers? So it's not just about saying you're doing all of these things wrong, but then also thinking about ways, how can I help you improve in a way that's meaningful? And then also, I guess there's the issue of recruitment agencies. So I think more and more now in the what companies are looking for, when they check, is that there should be some sort of screening process, some sort of due diligence process for recruitment agencies, that you are only kind of like working with ethical agencies. But I think, just beyond the screening process, also you need to kind of also look at what are the business models in place. As Melissa has also highlighted, it's increasingly complex. There are a lot of sub-agents, intermediary, hidden costs, etc. So what is the business model that is being employed? And then what is the relationship between the employer and the recruitment agencies, that they're using, that you want to also avoid a business model where maybe you are squeezing the recruitment agency. If the recruitment agency has problems or is in a kind of transactional contract where, their cash flows are restricted, right? There isn't, and maybe there's unfair payment terms, or payment terms are not really working well for them, that it becomes expensive, or maybe, not even practical for them to recruit ethically, they're going to pass on this cost to the workers. So I think there needs, while we can say that yes, recruitment agencies are part of the problem, but they also should be looked at as being part of the solution. So there needs to be some sort of engagement about how do you bring the recruitment agencies on board, that you create an environment where ethical recruitment agencies can thrive, and then you're slowly pushing out the bad players from the system, rather than saying, no, you're part of the problem. Let's create a business environment where, recruitment agencies are not needed, because that's not really practical.
Thanks so much, Melissa. I think that's a really interesting idea, talking about sort of building recruitment agencies up for success. And so that might have sort of trickle-down effects and impacts on the cost of recruitment. Yeah, very interesting. Over to Melissa, Akhir, again. So one of the key elements of promoting fair and effective recruitment is the presence of access to remedy measures. Could you share what good practice looks like when violations have occurred, and provide some recent examples of how this was particularly achieved in Malaysia?
Thank you so much. And I also have to start off with where we have a coherent national framework for responsible recruitment first. If we don't have that, then the access to justice and effective remedies become even harder, right? So first, if there's nothing else that's taken away, if we can have things within the National Action Plan and Business and Human Rights is one, but in substance, in structures, and in cultures. So the human rights cultures. So within there, if we can have a measurement of how good practices would be, it's not maybe focusing again, like what I said, to the rights holder, to the workers themselves, and whether they can come to Malaysia, there's no existing debt, and their lived realities is that they're not trapped, they have the full freedom to work in a dignified manner. So that should be the measurement of a good practice. And then moving on remedies, from SUHAKAM, we think effective remedies following international human rights standards as well should be available, accessible, affordable, and all the UNDP standards. But within there, there's some that have been pointed out in concluding observations. These are report cards on the status of human rights in Malaysia. So I'll quote one from CEDAW on discrimination against women. So there's a general recommendation number 33 on access to justice. And within there, it says that justice is not achieved simply by having complaint mechanisms or grievance mechanism. Instead, what I mentioned just now on in the laws itself, in the systems that are built, and in the culture and attitudes and practices, right? So from there, for women, the CEDAW committee in Geneva had pointed out to Malaysia that we're supposed to address the power imbalances in the outcomes. So when we look at the workers' lived realities, I will pick up once again the domestic workers, and to which Malaysia or with SUHAKAM and credit to the civil society who are trying to build the Domestic Workers Act that addresses these effective remedies. So when we have accessible, available, good quality, accountable, with all the support services that they need from the outset, then it means that the remedies may match their realities. R&R, remedies must match their realities. Instead of saying, you come to us, you have to navigate the formal complaint systems, including our courts. Malaysian courts are still not the most accessible for everyone. What about the languages on what they go through? Is it confidential? And as I mentioned before, the fear of worsening the situation, the fear of backlash. So this must be part of the remedy. So it's not just you get paid back the amount that you paid out. That's not it. The treatment themselves, how the criteria of human dignity has been served. So another one point, if we have the checklist, is effective remediation when there's violations. And that means also everything else on repayment, on compensation, restoration of their full rights must also be within the experience. So I'll just take one. On legal aid. So Malaysia has just gazetted a law on legal aid and Public Defenders Act. However, within this legal aid act, nowhere does it say there's options to support persons who are already facing difficulties and maybe fall below the poverty line who are not Malaysians. So that's already a gap in the law. And as the chair on law and policy in SUHAKAM, this is one of the things that we need to read together. Sometimes we think of labor laws as a separate part, but no, it has to apply with the overall, the second pillar of what I said, the structures. Is it built? And what's on paper in substance? I'll finish soon. But there have been encouraging examples of remediation. Some of you may have heard of social compliance audits and worker interviews. So some of the things have worked well with several countries of origin. So I'll say this again. As a National Human Rights Commission in Southeast Asia, we have had good collaborations with several Southeast Asian National Human Rights Commissions. So they're coming to Malaysia in July and in November, and we will try and do further effective remediation through their support with certain embassies who have been supporting their workers well. Yeah, there have been agreements in the form of lived realities. So again, within the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, we want all the aspects of grievance mechanisms and remedies to apply with social protections in a holistic manner. And also, when we say zero costs, employer pays principle, when SUHAKAM speaks to companies, some have pled ignorance on what happens in the country of origin. So this is no longer good enough. After this, there must be a know and show. You have to know and you have to show, right? Because you are getting the profits. So within this, SUHAKAM is happy to work together on how to know and how to show these aspects. And coming back to the broader ecosystem approach to remedy, how to navigate Malaysian laws, we have some of the technical expertise on that. And to tie it up, we are now submitting 2 reports to the Universal Periodic Review. So we encourage, if there's other countries here, please provide recommendations to Malaysia on these parts. And SUHAKAM may likely submit our own voluntary report in December. That's Universal Periodic Review on overall UNGP standards. 2, for CEDAW, I mentioned again, there are 4 areas that the CEDAW committee has asked Malaysia to report back. Deadline was last month. I've heard that it hasn't been submitted. But for civil society, we are happy to support you in providing your own report on the area of international protection. That is one of the 4 areas. International protection across borders for especially women and girls. Last point, we also have another report card on forced labor. On the Convention on the Rights of the Child, it came out in February this year, the specific recommendations. So we're not starting from zero. There's many parts on recruitment and exploitation that we need to focus, but some have moved forward on effective remedies. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic. Like, really glad to hear SUHAKAM's really busy, I suppose, in that sense. But if I could just sort of summarize that, I think it's really sort of this question to companies, to investigate whether your formal complaint systems align with your lived realities of workers, but also include intersectionalities. Sort of a word we've been hearing quite a lot. So over again to Akash. So we want to hear more about what happens in Amazon. So given your experience, what does implementing the EPP require from an operational standpoint? And how does your company ensure that vulnerabilities in the recruitment system are constrained, particularly when it comes to managing and safeguarding sort of the end-to-end processes of recruitment?
Great, thanks. I think I think there's a philosophical element here a little bit, right? How do you translate policy to reach a worker in the remotest parts of a village far before they've even entered your supply chain, right? Like, how do you build the mechanisms to make that happen? And how do you as an organization get comfortable with the fact that your policies and decisions are the furthest away from your immediate remit of control, but that's what's required to make this work responsibly? Those are some of the bits and bobs that you need to navigate to make that happen, right? So I think if I had to focus on one of the big things, right, it's get into the detail, right? It's being involved at least right from the beginning in partnering and understanding what the challenges are from the recruitment agency's perspective. How do you get into and understand how these jobs are being communicated out to workers? How they made aware that who the actual employer is, what the terms of employment are, how do you ensure that they understand the terms of work, and how are all those choices being made by workers transparently? They need to have full understanding of what it is that they're signing up for, and that's, I think, a key part here. Melissa addressed this already earlier about how recruitment agencies need to be part of the solution, right? We can't keep constantly hammering on them, expecting them to change when the ecosystem itself enables that behavior where workers are charged, right? And one of the things that we've been talking about is changing the language, right? There is a very common perception about how ethical recruitment costs more, but we've been saying that this is the true cost of recruitment, because all this while, workers, when they had to pay, they were subsidizing the cost that should have been borne by employees in the first place. So while you've been getting a discount, now you're paying the actual price. Of course, it can appear as a higher cost, but that language is important, right? I think how you frame it, how you challenge assumptions is important, how you navigate this. I think separately, looking at how there are lots of other companies, there's lots of other organizations, civil society groups who are working on the same issue. we do not need to reinvent the wheel. Where appropriate, how can we bring together the right forums for partners working on the same topics to get together to do this in a more coordinated fashion. I think in the grand scheme of things, a really good vision or something to work towards would be, I think when I'm speaking with agencies or recruitment ethical agencies, the challenges they face is, oh, there's only one company that wants to hire from us because everybody else wants to hire, from people they've been used to. But imagine a world where there's all these like 10 or 15, you don't need every single brand. 10 or 15 brands who really care about these issues get together and they're able to pool resources, and you're able to help support and grow the ecosystem of ethical recruitment agencies on scale, right? I think building that vision into your plans today help enable that protections down the line to make actually work. I think finally that to make this work operationally, let's not limit these conversations only to the sustainability or the human rights or whatever relevant private sector team. But this is a cross-functional thing, right? It's not just about the business team, but the human rights team, but also how are the procurement teams involved? How is finance involved? How are the operations team involved? How are people who are not looking at through their business functions, not necessarily looking at human rights, but how do you educate and bring them along with you on that journey, right? Because that transforms how you do this on scale as well. So I think sharing that load and doing this collaboratively across various teams actually make this a lot more long-term successful.
Yep, that makes sense. I think sort of a shared collaborative effort across, I think sectorally that works better as well in terms of sort of industry-wide, sector-wide. Thanks, Akash. Melissa, so recently I think it's been quite an sort of interesting, I think, chatter with the NEP+HR. One of the key things that the government wanted to do was set up this non-government, semi-independent and multi-stakeholder group that monitors the implementation of the NEP+HR. And so you are a member of this committee, but I sort of generally wanted to ask you a question on what would effective monitoring of responsible recruitment need to look like? And what are some indicators, evidence or stakeholder inputs would help to ensure that progress is not only reported at the surface level, but is really meaningful for migrant workers? And does that translate all the way to migrant workers?
So I think monitoring and evaluation, that's the difficult thing, right? So what would you consider as impact? And I think now, companies are also slowly growing their competencies and capacity in terms of how they monitor, what they monitor, and how can they do this in a more resource efficient way. So definitely, I think the post-arrival interviews and then, engaging with workers, whether you're an employer or a CSO, definitely will give you a lot of information. But I think we need to see there needs to be more than just passive participation of workers. So not just as an information resource. Okay, so I do an assessment, I go and interview the workers, and then this is the information that I got, and then I pass it on to management. Management comes up with a corrective action plan. We need to start building systems, and I think that's where CSOs and also trade unions working on these issues have a role to play, where workers are also part of the stakeholder group that gets to design the monitoring system that works for them. So they are part of the design, and they're also part of the corrective action and remediation. I think Sumita put the point across very well earlier this morning, where companies still see worker as worker, but you do not see them as, someone they can partner with, right? Even worker committees, sometimes the worker representatives there are management appointed, or very few, although there's a growing practice now by companies to have elected worker representative in the management committee, in the worker committees, and that's very important. So it's also about making sure that there is a platform where workers and managers can have effective dialogue, where the power dynamics are somewhat managed, right? So workers are empowered to be able to raise issues and to also be able to advocate for the solutions that they want. There are one or two companies that we have worked with that we also see have kind of invested in training for their workers. So it's not just about, having a worker committee and then say, okay, go function on your own. But actually they also invest to see how they can empower the worker representatives within the worker committee to be able to carry their tasks effectively as a worker representative. So I think that is a good practice and is very commendable for, companies to do that. I'm also quite interested to see what role digital tools can play. Also understanding that there are challenges in terms of accessibility when it comes to technology also, and data privacy and management and trust in the system. But I think now that's, we're in the age of disruption, there are, AI tools, and now people are going increasingly digital. I think it's something that we can think about as a complementary tool in terms of how workers can reach out to, say, third-party lines to be able to give information about their conditions, as well as for maybe buyers and other companies, third parties, to kind of have a sense, survey as to, what has been the impact, what workers are really feeling. I think there is a panel in these 2 days where we talk about worker voice too. So I think that's also something to kind of like look at. I do not think that, I think we need to see all these kind of like mechanisms need to work in tandem. I don't think there is one fixed way. I think digital tools are not going to fix all our problems. There still needs to be a human element to it. And audits still play a role. There are limitations to audits, but social audit compliance can also help in this regard. Yeah.
Thanks, Melissa. Yeah, I think it's really important that we sort of look at that relationship with workers and changing and shifting that relationship with workers. And I think overall everyone sort of wins. So we have about 7 minutes left. I want to try and get some questions from the audience if possible. So if I could get Carmen to help us out. And maybe if you can sort of provide the question to a speaker if that information is there. If not, we'll just go to whoever's willing to answer. Yeah.
Okay. So we have received a lot of questions online for people in the room and also our online audience. I'm gonna, drop them and you can choose who would like to answer them. So the first one is an operational question. How should companies fairly manage new recruitment fee claims that emerge years after remediation, where evidence is incomplete or inconsistent? The second question is not gonna get shorter, by the way, speakers. Is what is one concrete signal companies and government can look for over the next 12 months to know whether the NAP is working? And the third question is, we need to speak about bilateral labor agreements in places like Malaysia that are binding and meaningful. What are your reflections in contrast to MOUs? There are more questions, by the way, but I know they're packed, so I'm gonna leave you for the moment with this.
Thanks so much, Carmen. Does anyone want to volunteer to answer any of the questions first before I maybe put it to specific speakers? Akash, should we go? Any?
Sure, I can talk about the first one. If
Yep.
I understood that right,
claims.
it's about claims on reimbursement. So I think, I mean, we have, I do encourage folks to look at our Amazon Sustainability Exchange website, where there's a whole section on human rights and how we've communicated publicly how we've dealt with a lot of these challenges, and here are some templates that maybe other brands and others can borrow. Specifically on claims on reimbursement fees, right? I think it's a well-known fact. If a person pays a fee, you're not necessarily going to get a whole receipt and you paid X amount of money for. It just doesn't work that way. You're documenting, likely illicit activity. So I think you need to look at all the available evidence, right? Starting from worker testimony, and then see how you can, triangulate that information. Looking at information as flight bookings, looking at information on, hardly any worker comes alone in one single recruitment drive. It's always groups of workers, right? If all of them are saying the same story, the likelihood of it being true is quite high. So you need to think of clever mechanisms in which you can triangulate this data, look at the information, and take worker testimony deeply into your consideration, and then work out how that reimbursement process needs to work. So there's detailed guidance that Amazon has published on some of these bits, but I think worker testimony and triangulating information with other indicators, all of which give you an accurate representation of what should be the right amount for that particular group of workers.
Thanks, Akash. Anyone else want to tackle a question on claims or what success for the NEP would look like in 12 months?
Well, I will try the net B+HR question, especially, as a metal committee member. So we definitely don't want the net B+HR to fall in the trap of, Malaysia always have very nice plans. It's the implementation that suffers, right? And the net B+HR at the moment doesn't actually have timelines. But I guess the hope that I have for the net B+HR is because unlike the other nets, there's actually a semi-independent monitoring, evaluation, training and learning committee, who has actually only maybe met twice, and there's also a lot of work cut out for them. But what I'm hoping is that, in this kind of like for the next 6 months or less, that we look at prioritizing what are the things that we can do in the net B+HR and actually come up with timelines and also KPIs, right? So it's like what are the KPIs that we want to hit and what are the KPIs that we want to monitor to track progress. That is missing at the moment, but I think that's something critical that maybe the committee can work on together with the working group. So that gives us a bit of a roadmap. What comes first, and that at the end of the 12 months, there is a way for us to say, yes, we have made progress on these things because there's a roadmap. And of course, beyond the 12 months as well, because, the net B+HR does go on for 5 years. So I think that's basically what, I would try to look for. And also to say that in the net B+HR, there are a lot of elements around, due diligence, getting companies to strengthen their due diligence system, to look at the grievance mechanism, and then there's a huge labor component as well. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there, and that's something we should definitely look at.
Thanks, Melissa. And maybe, Mel, did you want to perhaps cover MOU or any of the questions that were asked?
Yeah, a quick one. The successful forms of MOU on working together, especially, like I said, within ASEAN countries, a lot of them when they provide the clarity. So just now we said there's a complex transnational recruitment chain. So within that chain, how do we map out with clear pathways? And then the indicator is how many workers had zero fees. They didn't have to pay any fees. So again, if we use, let's say, Gen Z language, is there like a green flag where employers actively already have a checklist of this is what we pay, right? It's very clear. And then the red flag, so then the workers know from the start, you must never pay for this. If they ask for this, that's not for you to pay. So some of these things are actually, technically, we have to match with ILO Fair Recruitment Principles and Guidelines. But because there's a question on timeline, I would like to also address the elephant in the room. So for the elephant in the room, the timeline, we will reach maybe a pre-election timeline, and then we will have the budget allocations. And is there any budget allocation by the government to work together with companies? So once again, for SUHAKAM, we are happy to bridge between the companies. It is not for employers alone or for companies alone. The government must also show their investments within this checklist and all that to become a standard practice and join with other countries. So, for example, the Indonesian embassy has come to SUHAKAM to work things out on domestic workers. And when I say the timeline, we must not forget the sustainable development goals. So even beyond 18 months, that is one of the things with the National SDG Center. And why I keep saying about budget, because the social protections and impact are supposed to be shown before each government agency gets its budget. Therefore, if we use the SDG indicators within here, we can match it with the ILO standards and the guidelines, and we can show in parallel how laws have been improved, policies and all that. And again, the elephant in the room is Malaysia has a federal constitution that says equal treatment before the law and equality before the law. And the second part of that says non-discrimination, no matter where your background is, where you came from. So to uphold this constitutional fundamental liberty within our laws, within the practices and within the culture is one of the focus that we need to do. But in the end, through whose eyes? Through the workers' eyes. That the employer had paid, and I do want to credit there's some foundations who have moved forward on the employers and the education of the workers. But through all this, for the framework to work, we have to come together and quickly tie it to the timeline that's available. So again, I would say, how many workers that we had, the response that said, no, zero fees, I didn't have to pay. Okay, that's all, yeah.
Thank you so much. And I think the ultimate timeline really is 2030, when the SDGs are meant to be achieved, and even our NAP+HR, multiple different sort of frameworks converging to 2030. But with that, I think, thank you so much to the speakers. Big round of applause for such an engaging conversation. And I think I'll pass the floor back to Sarah.
Thank you everybody, and thank you to all the panelists, our audience online and in person. Thanks to all the teams working in the background. So we'll have a 30-minute coffee break now. So you're welcome to go outside, enjoy some coffee, mingle, and then please we'll be back on time here at 11:30 for our fourth session. See you soon.